Bitcoin is going against the grain of history, and we're going to be talking about its 4-year cycles to better understand how it's going against history. So subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Let's talk about the 4-year cycle. Like this video if you enjoy videos like this going forward, and let's dive right into it. So Bitcoin develops 4-year cycles, and it's no surprise why that is, because every 4 years we tend to see a halving event, and this is a fundamental shift in the Bitcoin protocol where the amount of Bitcoin getting created every 10 minutes gets cut in half, and you have a halving event in candle 4 in 2016, a candle 4 in 2020, and candle 4 in 2024. And the thing about candle 4 is that it always tends to break beyond the 4-year cycle resistance, and this is a resistance that rejects price in candle 1, candle 2. It still is a resistance technically in candle 3, but it's broken in candle 4, and this is a historical tendency that tends to repeat throughout history. Candle 1, 2, and 3, even in 2019, is where we got a rejection. For 3 years, this 4-year cycle resistance is rejecting price, and you can see that even in this current cycle, candle 1, 2, and 3 rejecting from this 4-year cycle resistance, and in candle 4 now breaking beyond it. But how is Bitcoin going against the grain of history in this 4-year cycle? Well, we always see candle 4 break beyond this 4-year cycle resistance. That just tends to happen in the halving year in candle 4. But the thing about this candle 4 is that this candle 4 is breaking the 4-year cycle resistance before the halving. Historically, we tend to see candle 4 break beyond this 4-year cycle resistance after the halving. In this candle 4, in this year, we're actually seeing candle 4 break beyond this 4-year cycle resistance before the halving. And historically, we tend to see downside wicks in a candle 4 early on in the new year. We've seen this in 2016, and this candle 4 downside wick develops a macro high-low trend line relative to the bottom, the candle-bodied bottom of candle 3. And you can see this in the past in 2020 as well. So this downside wick also joins the candle-bodied bottom of candle 3 just to develop a macro higher low. And last year in August of 2023, I spoke about how we might actually get a downside wick into this higher low in 2024, because that's simply what history was suggesting to us. But what we're getting instead here is, of course, we did get a downside wick. There was an 18% correction earlier this year in January, but you can see how this is a far cry from what we've seen historically. Historically, we should have seen a slightly more volatile retrace. However, in this cycle, this was actually an 18% downside wick. So part of why we didn't retrace that much, even though we retraced 18% in this downside wick, here we didn't retrace that significantly because we saw candle 3 not top out at 30k like was the price in August. We topped out in candle 3 around 46k, the 4-year cycle resistance essentially. So a pullback from these levels was always going to yield us a much steeper higher low. But in this candle 4, that higher low is so steep. It's very steep by standards of history. And on the flip side, we're now breaking beyond this 4-year cycle resistance early on the cycle before the halving. So there are 2 points how this candle 4 is going against the grain of history. For one, it didn't pull back as much as it could have to develop a macro higher low. And 2, it's breaking beyond this 4-year cycle resistance before the halving instead of after it. And a big part of why this is happening, and one of the reasons we can understand Bitcoin's price action a bit better, is that there is a macro diagonal trendline resistance that tends to form across time, and it's a 8-degree macro diagonal resistance, and you can see across time. In the pre-halving period, we can see that Bitcoin rejects from this macro diagonal resistance, prompting a pre-halving retrace right over here, and you can see that this rejection from the macro diagonal resistance has occurred in 2019 and 2020 on numerous occasions, 1, 2, 3 to be precise, in the pre-halving period. And we even saw a rejection last month, as you can see here, prompting a 18% rejection. But this month, we still see that Bitcoin has broken beyond this macro diagonal. However, you can see that across time, still some rejection from this macro diagonal tends to occur after the halving, but then we are able to break beyond it and retest the macro diagonal as a new support, as this black circle showcases. So historically, after the halving is when we tend to see macro retests of the macro diagonal resistance. But before the halving, we reject from here. So essentially, we reject from here before the halving and turn it into a support after the halving. We reject from the macro diagonal before the halving and then hold it as a support after the halving. We reject from this resistance before the halving and we hold it as a support after the halving. And the same thing could have been the case in this cycle, but you're already seeing that Bitcoin is actually breaking beyond this macro diagonal resistance. And if we get a monthly close beyond here, that will confirm to us that this isn't an upside wick, because last month we saw an upside wick beyond this macro diagonal resistance. In 2019 we saw upside wicks, and in 2016 we saw an upside wick into the macro diagonal before rejecting. So if we get a monthly close beyond this point this month, that's going to confirm that Bitcoin has gone against the grain of history and broken this macro diagonal before the halving event. So that could actually set things up for a retest of the macro diagonal sooner rather than later. So in this case, in previous cycles, we've seen that this macro diagonal retests the macro diagonal as a support 1, 2, 3, 4 months after the halving. And very similar in this case as well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months after halving is where we get that retest of the macro diagonal. If we're breaking beyond this macro resistance right now, and we could pull back as soon as next month or around the halving or just after it, it's still going to be much sooner than what we've seen in the past before. And the last thing to mention here is that Bitcoin tends to break to new all-time highs 215 days after the halving. And this has been the case on 2 occasions across cycles. So could this be the case in this cycle, that Bitcoin simply breaks to new all-time highs earlier? Because after the halving, 215 days is the historical norm. But if we're getting and could get a monthly close beyond here, then a pullback into the halving event of the macro diagonal resistance to turn it into a new support, maybe we could see trend continuation to new highs a little bit earlier than what we've seen in the past. Generally speaking, we are seeing potentially Bitcoin go against the grain of history. We're already seeing the very initial signs of this happening, and this is relatively the first month in this 2024 year where we are seeing Bitcoin slightly go against the grain of history. But can we confirm that? Can Bitcoin confirm that it's indeed going to break this macro diagonal trendline with a monthly close? Is it going to sustainably maintain itself above the 4-year cycle resistance this early on in the cycle, this early on in candle 4 before the halving? Or are we still going to get some sort of pullback? And in this case, Bitcoin would be able to fall back on historical tendencies and just pull back below this macro diagonal before trying to break it after the halving. At the moment, things are going against the grain of history, and the 4-year cycle is still alive and well. But could we start talking about a slightly accelerated cycle? We're going to be talking about that in the next video, so stay tuned for that one. In any case, that's about it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward. I'm Rekt Capital, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.